What I want to understand is what's the difference between data governance and information governance? How would you separate the two of them?
Yeah, so it's a funny thing because I think there's a lot of confusion in the world between what is data governance, what is information governance. Data governance, for the most part, in my mind, is something that really focuses on structured data. There's a whole bunch of disciplines that fall under data governance, including metadata model management, data integration, data normalization, data ownership. A lot of those things that are structured metadata type fields fit on the data governance side. Information governance is about unstructured stuff. So Word documents, PowerPoints, anything else that you might find on a shared drive, anything that's not structured is unstructured. You have very similar conversations, but they're about very different topics. And it's a nice thing to try and integrate if you can.
Data governance is a framework through which you formalize the accountability, very much related to management of data in the space of how the data is owned, how the data is structured, the overall life cycle, the data architecture, and the tooling is required in order to manage the access and security aspects of data, right? Whereas information governance, if I look at it, it kind of provides the framework for making decisions to ensure there is an appropriate behavior towards regulatory compliance and other forms of compliance related to creating the information, storing the information, using the information, sharing the information, protecting the information, archiving and deleting the information. Atle.
I agree, but not entirely, because if you look, I look at information governance, yes, as information governance for me is the accountability framework for information, both structured and unstructured. Unstructured meaning documents, records, email, and so on. So it's an accountability framework for basically manage that that actually helps the organization come together. Stakeholders like legal, business, IT, compliance, and basically ensure that you meet their different requirements over the information lifecycle. Means how information is captured, how it's managed, how it's protected, how it's shared, how it's preserved, and so on. And then the difference between information governance, which I just described high level, and data governance, because an information governance depends on good data. You use data to manage especially the unstructured information. And therefore, data governance is a critical success factor for good information governance. But data governance is focused just on the data. So I look at actually information governance as a more broader term and domain, which requires good governance. And you need both to be able to turn information into an asset. You need both to be able to use information to add value, reduce cost, minimize risk, or identify new opportunities. So if you have poor data governance, you will also then therefore end up with poor information governance.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that data governance is more prevalent in the structured world is because the fact that it is structured and it requires a significant amount of data architecture, whereas in the case of unstructured world, we don't actually go through a data architecture phase because either we're using ECM systems where the architecture of the data architecture comes along with that, or we use unstructured repositories such as shared drives and other areas where you don't have the opportunity to actually create any structured model which you can use to store your information. Am I right?
Yep, absolutely. But it's also it needs to be looked at. You need to look at both in an organization, because for the metadata, for example, you use for managing information over its life cycle, if it's a capture project or how to better capture, or serving your customer, processing case files, or preserving records to meet your compliance requirements, the metadata used for that should be your master data that's managed by your data governance program. And
that's a really good point. Yes.
Yeah, and if you have it like that, that means in the future you can much easier also connect structured, unstructured information wherever there's a use case for doing that. So you're looking at some data and you would will perhaps automatically see the relevant content in support of that data, the context that actually explains how the data decision was put together.
And one other thing to add on to that, and I think where we really add value in this world is by being the people who take the responsibility for adding that added value, the structure, building the scaffolding around this blob of unstructured stuff. The scaffolding is the structured stuff that does tie it to the rest of the organization. The other thing that you find on information governance is that there's a lot of activity and thought and work around work processes and actual individual steps that you go through because of the fact that unstructured content really is very unstructured, and you have to put some structure around it. Some of that can be through workflow, which you generally don't do so much on the data governance side. There is some workflow to be concerned with, but nowhere near as complex and involved as on the unstructured side of things. So.
But also perhaps to add that information governance is not records management 2.0. It's two completely different things. It's information governance. Good information governance helps you find information, ensures the trustworthiness of information, it ensures the integrity of information, the completeness of information. While records management is managing information that either has decided is a documentation of a business decision, helps to ensure business continuity, or easier if it's required by law or to ensure business continuity. Those are the things that needs to be managed as records, which you could argue is just some of the information that's going to exist within your information governance scope.
So here's a question. So within the context of unstructured information, that's the world that we live in, is with, when I say, Microsoft 365, where, SharePoint and other systems, where this is still, there is a level of structure, but it is still qualifies as unstructured information repository, shared drives and other repositories. What's the role of data governance in this context, where all the time we talk about information governance, but is data governance part of information governance in this context, or is that still a separate entity on its own?
I think they work together very well because back in the early versions of SharePoint, when it started doing term stores and people owned different metadata values connected to the term store, the idea was that HR would own the terms that related to HR and that finance would own the terms related to finance. And that to me is a data governance issue, because it's about how do you define that data. Then that would go into the unstructured content. So there's a nice transition there. I think absolutely data governance is a subset of information governance, like I said. Another subset is records management. Another subset is data privacy and regulatory responses. And there's a lot of subsets that fit underneath that umbrella, but they're all interrelated. You can't see them as separate issues.
And I completely agree with everything that Brian is saying. I would just also like to add, just on a practical perspective here, and that is that when you're running a project, for example, governance in Office 365, if the organization doesn't have a good data governance program and have defined the master sources, to define the process, how to continue to improve their master sources, then it's going to be a much tougher journey getting agreement on what's the metadata, how keeping that up to date and so on. And you almost have to replicate things or do extra work versus if they already had good governance. And that's why they are so connected, and they both depend. You need them both to be successful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Listen, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but any final thoughts before I close this recording? Any final thoughts that you want people to hear about who are still struggling with data governance and information governance in the unstructured world?
Cheryl McKinnon at Forrester, former colleague of mine from AIM, she said once, software is not the silver bullet for information governance. And I think she's absolutely right. The key is, if you're looking at information governance or data governance, software or technology, it's not a critical success factor. What is the critical success factor, and I've said it many times before, is 80% about people, 15% about processes, and 5% about the technology. It's about getting different stakeholders to the table, getting agreement on what's the roles and responsibilities, what's the life cycle, what are the governance we need to have in place, ensuring that's how do we keep this up to date, how do we improve it, and so on. And that's why it's more about engaging people and getting agreement, setting up standard process and technology in support of that. But if you're going to implement an ECM system and a records management system or governance in Office 365 and so on, you need this information governance. If not, the solution, the framework will be out of date very quickly, and you're not going to get the value and the ROI that you could get if you set up good governance on top of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think a lot of people kind of look at it as a once-off implementation, but you need information governance to take it forward, to actually build on it. Implementing a records management or Microsoft 365 system and filling it up with data is the first step in that process. I think if you're looking for continuous improvement, you need to have an information governance framework.
As a last perhaps comment on that, the only thing constant is change. Is that, and change happens at different pace in different areas. Technology changes, especially in the cloud, changes almost every 2 months. There's some change to it. Our business process doesn't change that often, and our habits, our way of doing things, change even less. For example, on these computers, we have the QWERTY keyboard from the Remington typewriters. So since change happens in different pace, and technology is going to change very quickly, regulation will change now and then, your business process will change perhaps not that often, but also now and then. You need to build in a governance framework to ensure that this is optimal when change happens at different pace.
Lovely. Thank you very much. This is very insightful, and I'm sure we'll continue to discuss more on it.
Thank you.
Great.